She's already confused enough. If I push a little harder, the court will hand me her condo." Evan said it softly into his phone like my life was a file he could move across a desk. He thought I was asleep. I was not. I stood in the dark by my bedroom door, holding my breath so he would not hear me. On the speaker, a man answered calm. "You are sure she will not contest anything?" Evan laughed that short laugh he uses when he thinks he is the smartest one in the room. "Trust me, she is fading fast. She repeats herself, forgets things, gets turned around. The court here does not take long with people like her. Yeah, 650,000 just sitting there doing nothing. She is basically losing her mind anyway." The words hit harder than any slap. My hands curled against the doorframe, my own stepson turning my age into a strategy. For a second, I thought he had called a friend to complain. Then the other man cleared his throat and said, "I will run the numbers and draft a preliminary listing. That 640 range we discussed should move a condo quickly in Tucson. A listing." Evan sounded eager now. "Once I get power of attorney, I will sell the place and wipe my debts clean. We can list lower. I just need that paper that says she cannot manage her own life." I had seen that kind of paper at the hospital when families decided an older relative was inconvenient. I never thought my name would end up on one because of a man I helped raise. Evan paced in a slow circle around my coffee table. "She will not even notice," he went on. "I will put her somewhere safe, tell everyone it is for her own good. She works nights. She is alone. People expect someone like her to start slipping. They will believe me." Something inside me stopped shaking and went very still. I was 50, not 80. I worked nights as a nurse at St. Joseph's here in Tucson. Confused was the last word anyone on my unit would use about me. But in my own kitchen, my stepson was building a story where I was helpless, and my home was the prize. He moved closer to the hallway, and I stepped back into the shadow of my room, heart thumping but steps silent. I eased the door shut until it clicked. I stood there for a moment, listening to Evan open my refrigerator and end the call with the agent who wanted my address on a sign. I was not going to cry in my own bedroom because a 32-year-old with maxed out cards thought he could decide when my life was over. He thinks I am weak, I told myself, but he has no idea who raised me. I crossed to the dresser and pulled open the second drawer. Under a stack of shirts, my fingers found the edge of a metal document box. I lifted it out and set it on the bed. The label on the front was plain. Pima Trust Confidential. Most people who looked at me saw what Evan saw. A tired woman in scrub pants who went to work, came home, paid her bills, and lived in a paid-off condo. Her husband left her. They did not see the double shifts I had worked, or the nights Mark and I sat with a cheap calculator running numbers for retirement accounts and small investments. Evan certainly did not. He thought 650,000 was the full value of my life. He thought the court would nod along when he said I was confused and alone. My fingers rested on the lid of the box. I did not open it yet. Just feeling the weight of it was enough to steady me. I had money, real money, a record of every clear choice I had made for years. I sat on the edge of the bed, the box beside me, and let the truth settle. For years, I had done what women my age are told to do. Work hard, be grateful, do not make trouble. Trust that family will do right by you. Standing in that dark hallway, hearing my stepson sell pieces of my future to a stranger, something in that old lesson finally cracked. Have you ever had someone from your own family talk about you like you are already gone, like you are just in the way? If you have, the slow burn that started in my chest that night, and there was no chance I was going to let it die out. I walked into my condo just after 7 a.m, the Tucson sun already rising pale and hot over Desert Springs Park, the kind of dry light that made every surface look sharper than it really was. And I stood there for a moment with my bag still on my shoulder, letting the silence of the place wash over me after 12 hours of alarms and urgent footsteps and the soft, rattling breath of patients who needed more than I could give. Then I moved through my usual routine, because it kept me steady, checking the front door twice with a firm pull, checking the gas knob with a twist, writing the time on my small yellow checklist on the fridge, because old habits from nursing follow you home, whether you want them to or not. And I knew anyone watching me would see a woman who was careful and methodical, someone who remembered every detail of her shift and every change in her patient's charts, someone who did not misplace keys or forget where she parked her car, someone very different from the picture Evan was trying to paint. I had just taken off my shoes when I heard the knock, soft and too cheerful for morning, and before I could answer, Evan let himself in with the spare key. Mark insisted he keep years ago, stepping inside like he owned the air in the room, his eyes scanning the shelves as if they were inventory and not pieces of my life, and he smiled in that way he always used when he wanted something. "Just checking on you, Carla," he said, wandering to the living room, opening the cabinets beneath the television, closing them again, moving to the hall closet to peek inside, and every time a hinge made a sound, I felt a slow pull in my stomach because he was not checking on me. He was cataloging. "This place is way too big for someone your age," he said, while tapping the marble counter with 2 fingers, his tone light but cutting, almost playful. Then he added, "Do you ever get lost in here? Like genuinely lost because these hallways can get confusing." He said it like a joke someone forgot to laugh at, and he kept moving, opening a drawer in the kitchen and lifting one of my pill bottles to the light as if he could read his future in it. Then he placed it down again without asking. He had never cared about my medication before, or my pantry, or the organization of my closets. But today, he was interested in everything that could be turned into evidence, and I watched him for a long moment in silence, letting him think he was being subtle. I went to the bedroom to change, and the corner of my eye caught something on the floor by the nightstand, a thin sheet of paper, folded twice, maybe fallen from someone's pocket, and when I picked it up, the first line made my pulse stutter. "Temporary guardianship petition." It was not the original. It was a photocopy still warm enough like it had been printed that morning, and Evan must have slipped or dropped it careless in his confidence. My name was printed clean across the document, and under it a description that made my stomach tighten, suggesting I struggled with orientation, and recall suggesting I needed oversight for my safety, suggesting I was vulnerable enough that the court should place someone over my decisions, someone like him. I held the paper for a long moment as the room tilted slightly, not from fear, but from a cold recognition that Evan had moved far past thoughtless comments and was now walking a planned path, a path with signatures and courtrooms and consequences if I did not stop him with precision. I folded the paper again and slid it beneath a stack of folded towels where I knew he would never look, then picked up my phone and dialed a number I kept memorized but rarely used the line ringing twice before a calm voice answered. "It is me," I said quietly while leaning against the dresser so Evan would not hear if he drifted close to the door. "Please update the beneficiary access. Do it quietly and remove any pending request for secondary authorization." The person on the line paused only a second before saying, "Of course I will take care of it today," and the moment I hung up, I felt the faint shift in power, a silent reminder that despite what Evan imagined, nothing in my life was loose or forgotten. When I stepped back into the hallway, Evan was in the dining room with a tape measure stretched between his hands, muttering numbers under his breath, snapping the metal line back into the case with a sharp sound. And when he saw me, he smiled, as if measuring the walls of someone else's home was polite. "Just checking how you are doing," he said again, voice sugar sweet, moving closer, as though he needed to fill the space near me, his eyes briefly scanning my face for any sign of confusion or blankness he could twist into proof. I nodded and passed him, opening the blinds so the sunlight spilled across the table, bright and unforgiving, making every object in the room clear, and for a second I wondered if he realized how transparent he had become under that light. I poured myself a glass of water and watched his reflection in the microwave door as he took out his phone to snap a discreet picture of the living room, pretending to check a message, while the camera clicked softly, and I understood then that he had already decided my life was an obstacle, not a connection, and that he believed he was close to winning. He did not see the checklist on the fridge, or the careful order in the kitchen, or the fact that I remembered every moment of the night before he only saw the story he was writing for the court, a story that would hand him $650,000 and everything inside these walls. I stood there with the cool glass in my hand, feeling the weight of the photocopied petition hidden beneath the towels, feeling the invisible line I had just crossed the moment I made that phone call, and I knew I would not step back from it. Evan thought I was aging into weakness, but he was the one walking blind, certain the world would believe him because he said his lies with confidence. And as he walked toward the front door, promising to check on me again soon, in that falsely gentle tone, I let my face stay calm and soft, giving him nothing to read, because the seed of injustice he planted was already taking root in a way he could not predict, and I knew the climb had just begun. Grace Chapel always looked gentle from the outside with its pale stone walls and neatly trimmed hedges, but the morning of the charity luncheon, the parking lot shimmered under the Tucson heat, and I walked across it slowly, feeling the weight of the night shift still in my bones, carrying a tray of donated pastries, because I promised the coordinator I would bring something, even if I came straight from work, and I was ready for nothing more than polite smiles and quiet conversations until I heard Evan's voice rise above the soft chatter inside the fellowship hall. He stood near a round table of older women who came early every Sunday and knew every hymn by heart, women who gave advice without being asked and watched for signs of frailty the way some people watched for weather changes. And Evan spoke with this exaggerated concern that made my stomach tighten. "Carla forgot where she parked again," he said loudly enough for the room to pause. "I had to walk her around for 15 minutes. She got so turned around, poor thing." I froze for a moment near the entrance, the cold air of the hall brushing my face as the women turned to look at me with expressions soaked in pity, their eyes softening in that way people do when they think you are slipping away from yourself. And I felt the familiar sting of being treated like a fading photograph, even though my mind was sharp enough to remember every detail of the night before and every step of my drive to the church. I walked toward the table with my tray held steady, offering a small smile because arguing in a church hall was pointless, and I murmured a greeting just as one of the women patted my arm gently, as if I might crumble under her hand, saying something like, "Bless your heart, you must be so tired these days," and I nodded because what else could I do? Evan stepped closer, wearing that expression of strained patience he had practiced recently, the one that made him look like a burdened caretaker instead of a man plotting to take my home. And he said loudly enough for 2 more tables to hear, "I keep telling her to text me when she parks, but she forgets it is all right, though I am here for her." My chest tightened with a mixture of anger and shame because I had never asked him to be here for me, and I had not forgotten my parking spot, not once yet. The room was already filling in the story for him, a story where I was losing track of simple things, and he was the only responsible one. I set the pastry tray on the table and stepped back a little, choosing silence so I would not feed whatever script he was rehearsing, feeling eyes follow me as I took a seat near the wall where I could breathe. The lunch went on around me, conversations rising and falling, forks clinking, soft laughter echoing under the high ceiling, and I tried to focus on the speaker at the front who talked about donations for a community outreach program. But Evan kept drifting near me, hovering at the edge of my vision, like he wanted witnesses for his performance, pausing to say things like, "Did you take your vitamins today, or did you remember your mail? Or maybe we should get you checked for that memory issue you mentioned," each comment tossed into the air with calculated innocence. I took slow breaths and held on to the edges of my chair so I would not react too quickly or too sharply, because that was what he wanted. A moment he could twist something emotional he could use in court later, and I knew better than to give him anything. A woman from the knitting group walked up to me with a paper plate and asked if I needed help finding the restroom, and though her tone was warm, it hit something deep in me, something raw and familiar to every older woman who has ever been spoken over or spoken around, and I felt my face heat, but I kept my voice steady as I told her I was fine. Across the room, Evan watched, pretending to sip lemonade, his eyes lighting up like he had just collected another piece of imaginary evidence. I thought that was the end of it until the twist arrived, small and silent and easy to miss unless you were looking closely. One of the women at Evan's table, a sharp-faced woman in her 60s who rarely missed anything, leaned forward and narrowed her eyes at his wrist. Then she tapped the arm of the woman beside her and whispered something, her voice low, her gaze still fixed on Evan's Apple Watch. I followed her line of sight, and the realization came quick and cold. Evan had his watch angled toward me. The glossy screen faintly lit the small red microphone icon glowing in the corner as he recorded, not openly with his phone, like someone reckless, but quietly, discreetly using the watch so he could gather audio of me sounding tired or slow or anything he could manipulate later to support his guardianship petition. The woman glanced at him again, then at me, as if trying to decide whether to say something, but she looked away when Evan raised his glass to her in a polite nod, and I knew she would stay silent, not out of malice, but out of discomfort because accusing someone of recording in church made people uneasy. I felt the humiliation coil deeper in my chest, but I did not let it show. Instead, I smoothed the napkin on my lap and reached for a cup of water, moving calmly, breathing evenly, letting the cool liquid steady me as I watched Evan continue his quiet performance. He thought he was gathering proof, building his case, one whispered comment and one pitying glance at a time. But he did not notice that I had seen the watch, that I had seen the truth in the reflection on a silver tray at the center of the table. And he did not know that the moment I recognized what he was doing, I began something of my own. When the luncheon ended and people rose from their chairs, I walked slowly to the donation table and thanked the coordinator, letting the noise of chairs scraping and voices rising blend around me as I glanced one more time at Evan's wrist, confirming the watch screen still flickered. Then I stepped out into the bright Arizona heat, letting the sun hit my face, while the dryness wrapped around me like a shield, and I unlocked my car with steady hands, already knowing that if Evan wanted to gather data on me, I would gather more on him, quiet and patient, the way a nurse observes a pattern before naming it. I started the engine and sat there for a moment, letting the air conditioner push out the heat, feeling the humiliation still burning under my ribs, but also feeling something sharper, growing behind it. Something that was no longer fear or confusion, but resolve, the kind that forms when someone tries to rewrite your life in public and expects you to stay quiet. Evan had shown his methods, and now I would begin mine. The drive back to my condo felt heavier than usual, the sunlight pouring across the windshield in long white strips as I turned into the parking lot, still hearing the echo of Evan's voice from Grace Chapel. The false concern, the careful performance. So when I stepped inside and locked the door behind me, I let myself stand for a moment in the stillness, breathing in the faint citrus scent of the cleaner I used the day before, grounding myself before facing whatever new story Evan was preparing to paint. And it did not take long before the pattern revealed itself. The first sign appeared the next morning as I walked into the kitchen after waking from a short nap, my eyes landing on the faucet still running in a slow, steady stream, a thin ribbon of water glinting under the overhead light. And for a second, I wondered if I had forgotten it, because exhaustion can blur the edges of memory. But then I remembered rinsing my cup the night before and turning the knob tight, always careful. And as I stood there, with my hand hovering above the metal, I heard Evan's voice behind me, low and full of mock concern, saying, "Did you forget to close it again, Carla? It was still running when I walked in." My spine stiffened, but I kept my face calm, turning off the faucet with deliberate slowness as I said no. I did not open it this morning, my voice level, but Evan only smiled lightly, like someone patronizing a confused child. Then he walked past me to open the pantry door, rearranging a stack of canned soup, while humming to himself an easy, casual hum that made my skin crawl, because it meant he was comfortable here. Comfortable enough to move my things without asking, and comfortable enough to build his false narrative one detail at a time. The next day I woke to find the bathroom in a strange state, the towel I always placed on the right hook now draped loosely over the left, my toothbrush sitting in the opposite cup where Mark used to keep his before he passed, and the toothpaste cap left half open. In a way I never left it because I could not stand the mess. And when I asked Evan if he had been in the bathroom, he shrugged with that same innocent tone, saying, "Maybe you moved it and forgot it happens. Memory can slip when you are tired," and he said it so gently it almost sounded like care, until I saw the glint of calculation behind his eyes. Small things kept shifting over the next few days. The remote placed on the wrong table. My keys set near the stove, instead of the bowl by the door. The refrigerator left open just enough to trigger the soft alarm, and every time Evan happened to be there, he offered a quiet remark, a sigh, a slow shake of his head, all of it feeding a story that only existed in his mind, but would look very real if written into a petition. I kept my composure, moving through the condo like someone mapping a storm in slow motion, marking every misplaced object in my mind, not reacting, because reacting was what he wanted. And I listened to the way he spoke to the neighbors when we crossed paths, outside his voice loud enough for me to hear from a few feet away, as he said things like, "She seems a little off lately. She forgets simple things. I worry she might wander or get confused." And the neighbor, a kind man from 2 doors down, looked between us with a startled expression, as if trying to reconcile my steady posture with Evan's concerned tone. But Evan continued, anyway, painting the picture, stroke by stroke. One afternoon, after a long shift and a longer walk from the parking lot, I stepped inside and leaned down to untie my shoes, then froze because the faint click of the front door camera echoed through my phone, a sound I had almost forgotten because I rarely needed to check the footage, but I opened the app without hesitation, scrolling back through the last few hours, and as the tiny screen loaded, I felt the first real twist settle in my chest like a heavy weight. There he was, Evan arriving earlier than he said he would, carrying a black folder tucked under his arm, his steps quick and purposeful, and when he paused in front of the door to adjust the strap of his bag, I saw it clearly printed in bold capital letters across the side of the folder, the words "Real Estate Pre-List," unmistakable and cold and impossible to misinterpret. He had not even bothered to hide it, as though he was so sure I would not think to check. And as I watched him walk inside on the recorded clip, I felt a slow, rising heat spread through my chest. Not panic, but something firmer. Something that came from the deep part of myself that had spent years keeping things together. When life cracked around me, he was not just gathering evidence anymore. He was preparing the sale, getting the papers, consulting the listings, and I understood then that the faucet, the towels, the keys, the whisper to the neighbors, all of it was part of one long, deliberate pattern meant to corner me into a role I did not belong in. I put the phone down and stood in the center of the living room, letting the truth settle, letting the anger cool into clarity. And I knew that whatever Evan thought he was building, whatever story he believed the world would accept, was now turning into something else in my hands. He wanted proof of confusion, but what he gave me instead was a record, a timeline, a digital trail leading straight back to his intentions. And as I moved to lock the front door, I felt the quiet beginning of my own preparation. Not dramatic, not loud, but measured and precise. The way I had approached every crisis in my years at the hospital. If Evan wanted to create confusion, I would create truth. And if he wanted to make me look lost, he would find himself exposed by the very tools he used. The battle he thought he was winning had already shifted, and he had no idea the tide had begun to turn under his feet. The next few days moved with a quiet tension that settled into every corner of my condo, a heaviness I carried with me, even during my shifts at the hospital. And each morning, when I opened my eyes, I wondered what new angle Evan would push, what new thread he would pull in the story he was weaving around me, and it did not take long for the answer to surface. Not in my home this time, but in the world outside where numbers and paperwork carried weight. I had just sat down with a cup of coffee, the steam curling softly under the kitchen light, when my phone buzzed with a call from an unfamiliar number, and I almost ignored it until instinct made me answer. The voice on the other end was clipped and polite, identifying herself as a representative from the Social Security office, and she said they were calling to verify a recent report about my cognitive status, asking if I had experienced any memory lapses or confusion that might affect my benefits. The question hit me so sharply I had to grip the back of the chair, feeling a cold anger work its way into my spine as I asked what report she was referring to. And she replied in a tone meant to sound gentle that someone close to me had expressed concern about my ability to manage my affairs, someone who claimed to be acting in my best interest. I did not need her to say his name. I closed my eyes and let the silence stretch before answering, telling her clearly that I was fine, that I worked full-time as a night shift nurse, that there were no issues with my cognition, and she paused as if recalibrating, then thanked me before ending the call. But even after the line went dead, the echo of her words lingered in the room like smoke marking the beginning of a financial assault that was no accident. By noon, the second blow arrived. My debit card was declined at the pharmacy when I tried to pick up a prescription for one of my patients as a favor, and at first I thought it was a machine error. But when I called the bank from the parking lot, the representative spoke in the same careful tone as the Social Security agent, explaining that my account had been temporarily restricted due to a flagged concern about possible confusion or unusual activity, and they needed to verify some information before restoring access. I stood in the shade of the building with the heat radiating from the asphalt as I answered their questions, giving dates, confirming transactions, maintaining a level voice even as my pulse pounded because I could see Evan's fingerprints all over this, every question designed around the same fabricated narrative, every restriction, the direct result of someone telling the bank I was at risk of mismanaging my money. The representative apologized as she explained my funds would remain frozen for 48 hours while their review team completed the necessary checks, and as I thanked her and hung up, a heaviness settled in my chest, not fear, but disbelief at how quickly a single report could disrupt a life. Bills waited for no one, and in those 2 days I would not be able to pay for anything. Not utilities, not groceries. Nothing beyond what cash I had tucked in the drawer behind my recipe book. I drove home slowly, the sun sinking lower, the sky painted in washed-out orange, and when I stepped inside the condo, I felt the walls close around me with a new thickness, as if the place itself understood what was happening. I sat on the couch and stared at the muted television, not really watching, letting the weight of the situation sit long enough for the anger to sharpen into clarity, because this was no longer about small humiliations or rearranged objects. This was about control, about stripping away my independence inch by inch, so the court would see me as someone who needed oversight. When the phone rang again the next morning, I braced myself before answering, but nothing prepared me for the question that came through the line, spoken with the soft precision of someone reading from a screen. "Ma'am, is it true that your stepson has partial access to your trust account?" The words hit me harder than anything Evan had done so far, and for a moment I forgot to breathe. My trust account. The one Mark and I built slowly over years of saving and investing, the one I protected so carefully that the only people who should have known it existed were the trustee and myself. I asked the woman on the line to repeat the question, needing to be sure I heard it correctly, and she did, explaining that a request for secondary access had been submitted, but there were inconsistencies in the identifying information, so they needed to confirm whether I had authorized the addition. My fingers tightened around the phone as a cold understanding spread through me. Someone had tried to impersonate me. Someone had attempted to gain access to the trust, and that someone was the only person who stood to benefit from it. I swallowed my rising anger and answered firmly that I had not authorized anyone, that the request was fraudulent, and the representative said she would escalate the matter to the security team and place a hold to prevent any changes until further confirmation. After she hung up, I sat there in the quiet of my living room, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the ceiling fan, feeling the air shift around me as I took in the full scope of Evan's intentions. He was not only trying to paint me as forgetful, he was trying to pry open the financial core of my life, the one place he had never been allowed to touch, and the realization brought a steadiness I had not felt in days. I stood, walked to the front door, and looked out through the peephole at the bright walkway outside, breathing deeply as I let the rising clarity settle into my bones. He thought he was tightening the net, but all he was doing was leaving a trail, one I would follow carefully, quietly, until the truth wrapped around him with the same force he tried to use against me. That night, the air in my condo felt strangely heavy, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something, and after a long shower, I lay down on the bed, without turning on the television, letting the quiet settle, letting my breathing slow, letting the exhaustion of the last few days pull at my eyelids. I kept the lamp off the room dim except for the soft glow spilling in from the hallway, and I let my body sink into the mattress while my mind stayed sharply awake beneath the stillness because something inside me knew Evan was not finished. I closed my eyes, but my senses stayed alert, listening for the faintest shift in the house. And soon enough, the moment came so soft most people would have missed it. The slight metallic click of the front door unlocking a sound I had memorized over the years, a sound that should never have echoed through my home at midnight. I kept my breathing slow and even letting the darkness hide the tension in my jaw, and I listened to the faint footsteps approaching down the hall. Careful, measured steps meant to seem harmless steps that paused briefly outside my bedroom before the door eased open with a whisper. Evan stood there, framed by the dim hallway light, his silhouette long and still, and I felt the cool air shift as he stepped inside, taking slow, careful breaths of his own, as though he was nervous or savoring something. He moved closer until I could sense his shadow stretching across the blanket, and the faint smell of cologne drifted toward me, sharp and unfamiliar, because he had worn something different tonight, something that did not belong in my home. I kept my eyes closed and my hands still at my sides, letting him believe whatever story he had built about me, letting him think I was helpless in my own bed. He stood beside me for several seconds longer than someone checking on a sleeping relative, longer than someone with good intentions, and when he finally spoke, his voice came out in a low whisper, intimate in a way that chilled the air between us. "You are almost done, Carla, just a little more." The words settled over me like a cold cloth, and I knew then that he was speaking not about sleep or rest, but about the slow unraveling he thought he had engineered, the unraveling he believed would convince the court that my life needed to be turned over to him. He lingered a moment longer before stepping back, the faint rustle of his clothes marking each retreating movement, and then he left the room as quietly as he had entered, pulling the door until it clicked softly. I waited until his footsteps moved down the hall, waited until the front door opened and closed again, waited until the silence stitched itself back into the walls, and then I opened my eyes, the darkness sharpening around me like a blade finding its edge. I sat up slowly, letting the weight of what had just happened settle over my shoulders, because this was no longer manipulation or petty cruelty. This was a violation, a trespass into the one place I should have been able to feel safe, and the fact that he used Mark's old key made something deep inside me twist with a kind of grief that burned hotter than anger. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and reached toward the nightstand, where the small framed picture of Mark rested, a picture I had kept there for years, and with steady fingers, I lifted it just enough to see what lay behind it, the tiny black lens glinting faintly in the low light. It was a miniature camera smaller than my thumb, tucked neatly behind the frame, where only someone deliberately searching would find it, and I ran my fingertip along its edge, feeling the cool metal as if it were a secret weapon resting quietly in my palm. I had placed it there 2 days earlier after watching Evan enter the condo on the front door footage, after realizing he had grown bold enough to treat my home like a waiting prize. I positioned the camera so it faced the doorway of my room, angled slightly toward the bed, not to record myself sleeping, but to catch whoever entered without permission. And tonight, it had done exactly that. I stood, walked to the small desk in the corner, and connected the tiny receiver to my laptop, waiting for the screen to light up with the recorded feed. And when it did, the image was grainy but unmistakable. The hallway door opening slowly, Evan's figure stepping into the room, his posture calm, his head tilted in a way that suggested familiarity that made my stomach turn, and then the sound of his whisper captured clearly by the microphone, sending a shiver across the quiet space where I stood watching. For a moment, I let the footage play again, watching the dark version of him linger over my sleeping form, watching the scene with the distance of someone evaluating evidence rather than reliving a violation, because emotion could come later after I had secured everything I needed. I saved the recording in 3 separate files each, with a different name. 1 on the laptop, 1 on a drive I kept in the desk, and 1 sent to a secure cloud folder tied to the trust documents Mark left behind. And when the last file finished uploading, I closed the laptop with a quiet exhale, feeling something inside me shift from fear to a sharp, grounded determination. I returned the picture frame to its place on the nightstand, adjusting it so the angle remained perfect for whatever else the camera needed to catch, and I turned off the hall light before sitting back on the edge of the bed, letting the darkness wrap around me again. But this time, it felt different. Less like a void and more like a shield, a space where I could think clearly. Evan believed he was cornering me, that his midnight visit would push me closer to some imagined fog where I would forget my strength and hand over my life. But he had no idea I had already begun building the foundation of something far stronger than his lies. Every step he took inside my home had become evidence, every whisper captured, every intrusion recorded. And if he wanted to escalate, then he would find that I was no longer on the defensive, but quietly preparing a response. As I lay back down, my eyes open to the soft shadows on the ceiling, I felt the resolve settle deeper into my chest, steady and unshakable, because the next move would not be his. It would be mine. The letter arrived on a Thursday afternoon when the heat outside pressed against the windows like a heavy hand, and I found it wedged between the electricity bill and a grocery coupon booklet. The envelope thick and official, with the seal of Pima County stamped in the corner, and the moment I saw it, my stomach tightened, because I already knew what it would say before I even opened it, as if the weight of the last weeks had prepared me for the exact shape of this blow. I carried it to the kitchen table and sat down slowly, letting the quiet of the condo settle around me, letting the steady hum of the refrigerator mark the seconds as I slid a finger beneath the flap and unfolded the papers inside my eyes, scanning the first lines until the words blurred into a single heavy sentence that seemed to echo across the room. Petition for adult guardianship. Filed by Evan Clark. The reason section was highlighted with phrases that felt like a hand squeezing the air from my lungs, words like confused and emotionally unstable and declining cognition, strung together by someone who had crafted a lie so carefully he believed it would become truth once placed on official paper. I held the top page between my fingers and read it again, slower this time, forcing myself to absorb each accusation, as if facing them head-on would make the weight easier, but instead it settled deeper, like a stone sinking through water, pulling everything around it into a quiet dark. I leaned back in the chair, letting the paper fall against the table, staring at the grain of the wood, as if I could anchor myself there, because seeing those words printed in black ink approved by a clerk stamped and filed was different from the whispered lies at church or the staged confusion in my kitchen, different from the midnight intrusion that still played in my mind. This was official. This was the thing he had been building toward with every manipulation, every small cruelty, every calculated humiliation. He had taken my life, reduced it to bullet points, and handed it to a judge who had never met me. I felt the edges of fear begin to creep in a slow tightening in my chest, the kind that comes when a person realizes someone has tried to erase their autonomy, not through violence, but through paperwork, through systems that are supposed to protect you. I closed my eyes, inhaled deeply, and forced the fear to settle, because letting it spread would give Evan exactly what he wanted. After a long moment, I stood, walked down the hall to the bedroom, and stopped in front of the small safe, bolted into the closet floor, the one Mark and I installed together after his diagnosis, when we began preparing for a future we knew might shift too quickly. I keyed in the code with steady fingers and opened the door, feeling the cool air inside brush my skin as I pulled out the thick binder labeled Pima Trust, its corners worn from the years I had handled it, and I carried it to the bed, sitting with it across my lap as I opened the first page. The trust documents were exactly as I had left them, the careful notes from meetings with Mark, the signatures from the trustee, the list of assets we had consolidated over time, each line, a record of sacrifice and careful planning, and by the time I reached the updated valuation sheet, I felt the darkness of the earlier moment begin to shift. $1.4 million. That was the current value calculated after the market adjustments we made the year before Mark passed, and seeing that number there solid and irrefutable reminded me that I was not the fragile woman Evan imagined, not the vulnerable adult he was trying to present to the court. I turned another page and found the certificate from the Rehabilitation Center in Midtown Tucson, the one Mark and I had invested in when it was still a tiny operation, and my name sat there clearly listed as co-owner, a quiet truth I had never shared widely because it felt like something personal, something I wanted to protect. I ran my hand along the edge of the page, feeling the tangible weight of who I truly was settle against the hollow Evan had tried to carve inside me. This was my life, my decisions, my work, my future, and no petition written out of greed or desperation could overwrite that. I closed the binder and set it beside me, then leaned forward with my elbows on my knees, pressing my hands together as I tried to understand the shape of my emotions. Part of me felt shaken, not because the words on the petition were true, but because of how easily someone could weaponize a system built to protect vulnerable adults, twisting concern into control, turning procedure into a trap. Another part of me felt something colder and stronger rising, a steadiness that grew from the realization that Evan had underestimated the wrong woman. I stood and returned the binder to the safe, locking it with deliberate care, and when I straightened, I caught my reflection in the closet mirror, my expression no longer clouded by confusion or fear, but sharpened by a clarity I had not felt in weeks. He thought he could file a petition and watch me fold, thought he could use the veneer of legal authority to silence me. But what he did not understand was that every attack he made only pushed me further into the truth of myself, into the strength I had spent years building in hospital corridors and quiet nights beside Mark's bed. I stepped into the hallway and looked toward the living room where the letter still waited on the table, and I felt a shift deep inside a turning point, a moment where something in my story snapped into place. Evan believed he was nearing victory, believed he had finally cornered me in a dark tunnel with no exit. But what he could not see was that I was already gathering the tools I needed, not only to defend myself, but to unravel his entire plan. And as I walked back into the kitchen, lifted the petition again and laid it flat beneath my palm, I felt the darkness loosen its grip just enough for resolve to settle in its place, steady and unbroken. The morning after I read the guardianship petition, the air in my condo felt sharper somehow, as if every object carried a thin electric charge, and I moved through the rooms with a steadiness that surprised even me, gathering everything I had quietly collected over the last week, laying each piece out on the dining table, like instruments before a surgery. The first item I placed down was the small drive containing the footage from the miniature camera behind the picture frame, the grainy but unmistakable image of Evan entering my bedroom while I pretended to sleep, his shadow leaning over me, his whisper cold and deliberate, a truth recorded without his knowledge, and I felt a fierce steadiness in my chest as I set it beside the second piece of evidence the audio file captured from his watch at Grace Chapel. The one where he said, with easy confidence, that I forgot where I parked and that I could not remember simple things. I listened to that clip again, the way his voice dipped into false concern, the way the women around him murmured sympathetically, and I watched my own reflection in the dark screen of the laptop, seeing someone who had finally reached the point where silence was no longer surrender, but strategy. I opened my email and pulled up the forwarded messages from the real estate agent, the ones I had saved before Evan could erase the trail, noting the timestamps, each one matching the timeline he had built behind my back, each one proof that he had intended to sell my condo the moment he gained legal control. The most damning line came from his earliest message, the bold, "You can list it around 640 to move it quickly," a sentence so casually cruel it made my throat tighten, because he had been planning my displacement while sitting across from me at family dinners, smiling, pretending to care. I added that message to the folder I had labeled simply Court, and beside it I placed the printed screenshot of the video from the front door camera, the clear image of him carrying the black folder with the words "Real Estate Pre-List" printed across it, walking into my home as if he were the rightful owner. By the time I finished assembling everything, the table looked like a map of Evan's intentions, every piece of evidence a thread that led straight to the heart of his plan. And as I stood there, I felt something shift inside me, something that had been quiet for a long time, rising to the surface with a calm, cold certainty. I gathered the folder and drove to the legal aid office downtown, the building modest and sun-faded, but familiar to anyone who had ever needed to defend themselves against someone with louder lies, and when I stepped inside, the waiting room smelled faintly of old carpet and photocopier toner, grounding me in a way I did not expect. When my name was called, I followed the young attorney into a small office, lined with boxes, her expression sharp and attentive, as she motioned for me to sit, and I placed the folder on the desk between us with a deliberate movement, feeling the weight of everything Evan had done settle into that single moment. She opened the folder as I explained the situation, starting with the guardianship petition, moving through the staged confusion, the financial interference, the attempted trust access, and finally the intrusion into my bedroom, my voice steady even when the memory of him standing over me sent a chill up my spine. The attorney listened without interrupting her eyes, narrowing as she reviewed each piece of evidence, her hand pausing over the recording file, then over the email to the agent, and after several long minutes she leaned back in her chair with an expression that blended anger and relief. "We can win this," she said, her voice firm in a way that steadied me almost instantly. "But you must stay silent until court. No confrontations, no accusations. Let him believe the story he created is holding together, and when we stand before the judge, we will let the truth collapse around him." The words settled over me like a protective layer, and for the first time in days, the panic inside me eased, replaced by something quieter, something solid. I nodded, gripping the edge of my chair, as if anchoring myself to the moment, and when I walked out of the office into the hot, dry air outside, I felt a clarity in my step that had been missing since the first sign of Evan's manipulation. I drove straight to St. Joseph's Hospital and walked into the neurology wing as naturally as if I were starting another shift, greeting the nurses who knew me well, and I signed up for a full cognitive evaluation. something I knew would cut through every false claim Evan had made to the Social Security office, the bank, and now the court. The test took nearly 2 hours, and I completed each one with the quiet certainty of someone who remembered every detail of her life, someone who had spent years charting medications, monitoring symptoms, documenting shifts with precision. And when the neurologist looked up from her notes, with a faint smile, I knew even before she spoke. "Everything is perfectly normal," she said, handing me the printed results. "Your cognition is strong, no decline. Nothing concerning." I held the papers in my hands for a long moment, feeling the weight of them settle into my bones, knowing exactly what they meant. They were the key that would break Evan's entire petition, the truth he never expected me to gather, the proof no judge could ignore. And as I stepped back into the sunlit parking lot, the heat rising around me in shimmering waves, I felt something inside me click into place. Evan believed he had built a case so tight I would crumble beneath it, but he never imagined I would meet him step for step, gathering truth while he gathered lies. He had no idea the evidence I carried now would tear every accusation apart the moment it reached the courtroom. And for the first time since this began, I felt the quiet, powerful certainty of the word forming inside me, the one I would say, not with fear, but with resolve. No. When the court date finally arrived, the air inside the Pima County courtroom felt colder than anything outside in the Arizona heat, and as I stepped through the wooden doors with my attorney beside me, I felt the weight of every sleepless night settle across my shoulders, yet underneath that heaviness pulsed a quiet, unwavering certainty, because I knew what I was carrying in my bag, and I knew Evan had no idea that every lie he planted was about to unravel right in front of him. But when I saw him already seated at the petitioner table, hunched forward with his hands clasped for dramatic effect, it struck me how practiced his posture looked, almost like a man who had rehearsed grief in a mirror. He kept glancing toward the judge as if hoping she would notice his trembling fingers, and when he finally saw me take my seat, he pulled in a breath and lowered his eyes in a performance so exaggerated it almost made me laugh, though nothing about this moment was remotely funny. The clerk called the case number in a crisp monotone, and Evan straightened in his chair, whispering something like, "Watch this," under his breath. Then his attorney rose and painted a picture of me, so distorted it felt like listening to a stranger's obituary, describing how I supposedly wandered the aisles of grocery stores, confused, how I left burners lit for hours, how I could not remember the date of my late husband's passing. And while he spoke, Evan nodded vigorously, even dabbing his eyes once with a tissue, as if he himself were the injured party. When the judge looked at him directly, he delivered his lines with rehearsed fragility, saying, "I just want to protect her. Your Honor. She is declining faster than she admits last month. She forgot my father's birthday, and she completely froze while cooking and almost caused a fire, and the judge's pen moved across her notepad, while the courtroom remained painfully silent, every whisper of the air conditioning sounding louder than it should. My attorney leaned close and whispered, "Wait until your turn," and I kept my expression steady even though inside my heart felt like a drum pressed against my ribs. Evan continued his monologue, claiming I misplaced checks, forgot conversations, repeated questions. And the more he spoke, the more the women in the gallery shook their heads in sympathy for him because he looked so earnest, so convincingly wounded. And when he finally said, "She is not safe, living alone, Your Honor. I fear she will harm herself or someone else." The judge lifted her gaze and asked if there was any concrete evidence of cognitive decline. Evan hesitated for the briefest half-second before saying, "Yes, of course, I have recordings and witness accounts. She gets confused constantly." Then his attorney submitted a stack of papers I recognized immediately as the packet he created through manipulation, misunderstandings, and outright lies. The judge skimmed silently for several long seconds, then looked at me with a neutral expression that revealed nothing, and she asked, "Mrs. Evans, is there anything you would like to say?" I felt the entire room shift as if all the weight that had been crushing my chest suddenly lifted, and I rose slowly, smoothing the front of my blouse with steady hands before answering with a calm clarity that felt like stepping into sunlight after months of darkness and fear. I brought something for the court. Evan's head snapped up so fast the tissue slipped from his hand, his mouth parting slightly, as if he had not anticipated I would speak at all, let alone with confidence. The judge gestured for me to continue. I opened my folder and handed the flash drive to the clerk who connected it to the courtroom monitor, and as the first video file loaded, Evan shifted uncomfortably, his knee bouncing under the table in small, nervous jerks. The screen lit up with the grainy night vision footage of my bedroom, my silhouette under the covers, and Evan entering with the old key. He insisted he no longer had his figure leaning over me in a way that drew a sharp breath from someone in the audience. His whisper filled the room, every syllable echoing off the wood panels. "You are almost done." "Carla, just a little more." And a collective chill moved through the gallery. Several people glancing at Evan with pure disgust, while he stared at the monitor with a face draining of color. Before his attorney could object, the second file began to play the audio clip taken from the watch, Evan's unmistakable voice laughing at the church fundraiser, telling strangers that I forgot where I parked, and that he worried I might wander off exaggerating my movements for entertainment, painting me as helpless because humiliation made the lies more believable. Then I asked the clerk to open the third file, an email screenshot projected large and clear across the screen. Evan's request to the agent stating we can list it around 6:40 to sell fast once paperwork is final. And this time, the judge put her pen down, entirely folding her hands as she stared at the evidence, with an expression that carried no sympathy whatsoever. Evan's attorney scrambled to object on grounds of context, but the judge raised a hand to silence him before turning her attention to Evan directly, her voice sharper than before as she asked, "Mr. Evans, is this your communication?" Evan stuttered and swallowed hard, glancing at me like he expected me to rescue him, but I remained still, and he finally muttered, "Yes, but it is not what it looks like," except it was exactly what it looked like, and the judge knew it. My attorney submitted the cognitive evaluation next, the results stating clearly that I had no impairment of memory, reasoning, judgment, or orientation, and the judge read it thoroughly before leaning back in her chair and speaking in a tone that cut through every lie Evan had woven. "Mr. Evans, this is clear financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Your petition lacked credible evidence. Your actions demonstrate intent to obtain control over your stepmother's property through manipulation and misrepresentation." And the courtroom erupted into hushed murmurs, while Evan's face collapsed into a mask of panic so intense he could no longer pretend, his earlier confidence evaporating, as if someone had pulled the ground out from beneath him. The judge denied the petition with immediate effect, ordered a temporary restraining directive, and referred his actions for review under elder protection statutes, writing firm, clean strokes on the paperwork, while Evan whispered no over and over under his breath, looking at me as though I had betrayed him, despite the truth being that he had orchestrated every moment that led us here. I sat down slowly, my pulse steady, now a deep breath filling my chest with something I had not felt in a long time, something close to freedom. And as the judge adjourned the hearing, I felt every remaining thread of his control snap at once, as if the courtroom itself had severed whatever hold he believed he had over my life. When the gavel struck and the hearing ended, I felt the tremor of finality ripple through the courtroom, as if someone had unlocked a door I had been pushing against for months. And while people slowly filtered out, whispering about what they had just witnessed, I remained seated for a moment, letting the reality settle, that the guardianship petition had not only been denied, but dismantled in front of everyone, leaving Evan exposed in a way he never imagined possible. He hurried past me with his eyes fixed on the floor, as if avoiding my gaze could undo the humiliation that clung to him. and when he reached the hallway, he snapped at his attorney loud enough for half the gallery to hear that none of this was supposed to happen, then stormed toward the exit with the frantic steps of a man who had finally realized his cruelty had consequences. The first official blow landed quickly, because within hours the judge signed a no-contact order that barred him from coming near me for a full year. And when the officer handed me the document to keep for my records, I felt a calm resolve move through my chest, the kind that comes when the air finally clears, after a storm you thought might never end. Then came the second blow when the clerk informed his attorney that the case had been referred to the Elder Abuse Monitoring System for review due to clear financial manipulation. A label that would follow him quietly but firmly in any background, check any employment attempt, any inquiry into his character, and though I did not celebrate it out loud, I felt something inside me stand a little straighter, because names matter, and the truth had finally attached itself to his. By the next morning, the neighbors in our complex had already heard the news, since Tucson communities tend to move information faster than the desert wind, and as I walked out to pick up my mail, several people looked at me with a mixture of concern, respect, and relief, while those who had once offered Evan friendly nods now avoided eye contact entirely. I overheard one woman telling another that she had suspected something was off when Evan kept making comments about my memory and trying to get access to the HOA documents, and another neighbor shook his head saying he could not believe someone would do that to his own stepmother, then lowered his voice in shame for ever believing Evan's stories about me being confused or forgetful. That same afternoon, I stepped outside again and noticed Evan's girlfriend packing clothes into her car, slamming each door harder than needed, her eyes red from crying or fury or both. And though she spotted me standing on the walkway, she did not say a word, only shook her head and muttered "unbelievable" before getting into the driver's seat and pulling away with tires screeching slightly against the pavement. I realized then that while I had been fighting to keep my home and my dignity, Evan had been weaving a narrative not only for me but for everyone around him, and now that his lies had unraveled, he had nothing left to stand on. No allies, no benefactors, not even the woman who once excused his shortcomings because she believed the charming version of himself he performed for her. For the first time in months, my condo felt safe again, the silence inside no longer carrying the echo of threat, but instead, a soft steadiness that reminded me of who I had always been long before Evan tried to rewrite me into some fragile figure he could manipulate. I made tea, sat at the small table overlooking the courtyard, and allowed myself a long breath that felt like reclaiming every inch of space he had tried to occupy. I knew my shift at the hospital would start soon, and the familiar rhythm of checking charts and soothing anxious patients grounded me more than anything else, reminding me that competence is often quiet but unmistakable once someone tries to erase it. 2 days later, the twist I did not anticipate arrived when I received a call from the physical therapy center I had quietly invested in years ago, the one Mark and I had put money into when we were younger and hopeful, and imagining a small piece of stability for our later years. The director asked if I could come in for a meeting, and though her tone revealed nothing, I sensed something positive waiting beneath her request. When I arrived, she welcomed me with a warm sincerity, offering coffee before sitting down with a folder that she placed gently in front of me, while explaining that after reviewing recent financials and acknowledging my long-standing role as a co-owner, they wanted to extend a formal offer for me to step in as co-director, a position that would not only increase my income significantly, but also place me in a respected leadership role within the center. For a moment, I could not speak, because the weight of the past months had pressed so hard on my shoulders that I had forgotten what it felt like for something to rise instead of fall, and as she continued describing the responsibilities and how my background as a nurse positioned me perfectly for the role, I felt a sense of worth return in full force, not loud or triumphant, but steady and earned. I accepted with a nod, my voice calm though my hands trembled slightly, and as I left the building, the evening sun stretched across the parking lot in long golden lines that made everything look warmer than usual. I sat in my car for a few seconds, with my hands resting on the steering wheel, thinking about how Evan once walked around my condo measuring cupboards and door frames as if preparing to erase me. And now here I was, stepping into a future brighter and stronger than anything he could have imagined or controlled. The fallout had not broken me. It had clarified me. And though he had tried to reduce me to a burden in the eyes of a court, a community, and myself, the truth had done what truth always does. Once given room to breathe, it settled into place with a quiet certainty that no lie could shake. When the first call came, I almost let it ring out because the number was unfamiliar, and after everything that had unfolded, I had learned to guard my peace tightly. Yet something in me said to answer, and the moment I heard Evan's voice, I recognized a tone I had never heard from him before. One stripped of arrogance and bravado, a tone trembling somewhere between fear and humiliation, as he said he had been served an eviction notice and that he had nowhere to go, and then after a shaky breath, he added that I was still family and surely I would not let him be on the street. I stood in my kitchen with the afternoon light spilling across the counter, and I let the silence stretch because I wanted him to feel the weight of his words and the gravity of what he had done. And I realized in that quiet moment that he was not asking for forgiveness. He was asking for rescue. The same rescue he had always expected from others, the kind he had tried to force from me by painting me as incompetent in court. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm and steady, almost soft, but with an edge that even I had never heard in myself before, as I told him that family does not do what he did, and the moment those words left my mouth, there was nothing more to say. So I lowered the phone and ended the call without another sound, feeling no guilt and no hesitation, because I understood that allowing him back into my life would only invite the same cycle of manipulation and entitlement he had relied on for years. Later that evening, as I walked to the mailbox, I found myself replaying the panic in his voice, realizing that it was not remorse, but desperation. The kind that comes only when a person realizes every bridge they thought would stay intact has burned behind them, and when I looked up at the desert sky stretching pink and gold above the complex, I felt something settle inside me, a quiet release, reminding me that boundaries are not cruelty, they are survival. Word traveled fast in Tucson, the same way it always does, and by the end of the week, one of the neighbors casually mentioned that Evan had moved into a shelter on the south side, her tone neither sympathetic nor judgmental, simply stating a fact that hovered in the air like a reminder that choices always catch up no matter how far someone tries to run from them. I nodded politely and continued on my way, not allowing the information to disturb my evening, because even though a part of me remembered the boy Evan used to be before, resentment hardened him. The man he became had tried to take everything from me, and compassion can exist without surrender. At home, I made tea and sat near the window where the pale evening light spilled across the hardwood floor, letting myself breathe in the kind of stillness I had not felt in months. And as the warmth from the cup seeped into my palms, I realized that the final step in securing my future was something I had been considering ever since I went through the documents in the safe. I pulled out the folder labeled Pima Trust and read through each page again, slowly understanding with absolute clarity that if Evan dared once he could try again, or someone else could, because vulnerability in the eyes of greedy people is not about age or health, but about opportunity, and I refused to leave a single opening ever again. So the next morning, I drove to the estate attorney's office, a small stucco building near the foothills with a quiet lobby and the comforting scent of coffee drifting from a back room. And when the attorney greeted me with a warm handshake, I told him I wanted to place the condo into an irrevocable living trust, something permanent, something ironclad, something that would ensure no one could ever petition for access or attempt to use guardianship laws to seize control of my property. He listened carefully, reviewing the documents I brought, nodding with an approval that carried a hint of admiration as he said that it was an excellent and proactive choice. And as we went through each form, my signature flowed across the pages with a certainty that felt like closing the last door Evan had ever tried to pry open. When the final document was signed and notarized, the attorney slid the folder toward me and explained that from this moment forward, the condo was legally untouchable, fully shielded, locked into a structure that not even a court challenge could unravel without substantial proof of fraud. And since every asset inside the trust was clearly documented and legally assigned, no one, including Evan, had any standing to interfere. Walking out of that office felt like stepping into a new life, one where the shadows Evan cast over my days finally dissolved. And as I drove through the warm Arizona morning with the mountains rising in soft blue ridges ahead of me, I felt not triumphant, but peaceful, steady, unshakable. For the first time in a long time, I understood that protection is not only about locking the doors at night or setting boundaries with toxic family members. It is about claiming your story before someone else rewrites it, about securing your future before someone else gambles with it. And in that moment, I realized that what I had done was not just a legal decision, it was an act of self-respect that had been waiting inside me all along. When I returned home, the condo felt different, not because anything had changed physically, but because now it was truly mine, safeguarded, rooted in a future that no longer had room for exploitation or fear. And I stood in the center of the living room, letting the quiet wash over me, thinking of Mark, thinking of everything we had built, thinking of the strength I had discovered in myself, piece by quiet piece. And I whispered a soft, "Thank you," to the empty room, knowing he would have been proud. In the weeks that followed, something inside me began to settle in a way I had not felt since before Mark, past a quiet steadiness that grew slowly each morning as I returned to my routine, waking before sunrise, brewing the same simple coffee he used to like, tying my hair back before heading out for my shift at the clinic, and although the work was tiring and sometimes heavy, it grounded me, reminding me that purpose is often found in caring for others, even when life tries to make you feel small. And as I walked through the halls with my badge clipped to my scrub top, I noticed how patients smiled when I entered the room, how my coworkers leaned on me for support and guidance, how people who truly knew me never once questioned my mind or my clarity, and the contrast between their trust and Evan's manipulation made me understand more deeply that the way someone treats you is a reflection of their character, not your worth. On my days off, I found myself drawn to the small folder of ideas I had kept tucked inside my desk drawer. A list of programs I had once dreamed of creating for older women who faced financial abuse from their own families, ideas I had quietly developed long before Evan tried to make me another victim of that same cruelty. And as I read through the notes, I felt a spark return, something warm and determined, something that whispered that surviving was not enough, that healing meant building something that turned my pain into protection for others. So I began making calls during lunch breaks, first to a local nonprofit director who remembered Mark fondly and welcomed me with a kindness that eased my hesitation. Then to a community development officer who had long supported programs for vulnerable adults, and each conversation pushed the idea forward inch by inch until a small but promising partnership formed, allowing me to contribute both time and a modest portion of the Trust's annual yield to fund workshops and legal clinics for women who had been taken advantage of by family members. And with every step, I felt the weight of what Evan had attempted grow lighter, replaced by a quiet pride that came not from revenge alone, but from turning a broken moment into a lifeline for someone else. Tucson moved through spring into the early heat of summer, the kind that paints the mountains in a dusty lilac haze. Each evening and one afternoon, as the sun dipped low, I stepped out onto my balcony with a glass of iced tea, letting the last warm rays settle across my shoulders while the desert breeze carried the faint scent of creosote after a light rain had passed, and in that stillness I felt Mark's presence again, gentle and steady, like he always was, as if he stood beside me, watching the city change colors. I closed my eyes and let the moment wash over me, breathing in the peace I had fought so hard to reclaim. And when I finally spoke, the words slipped out in a whisper, meant only for him, as I told him that I had protected what he left me, not just the condo, but the life we built, the dignity he always said I deserved, the future he hoped I would keep safe when he no longer could. The wind stirred softly as if answering me, and I opened my eyes to the fading light stretching across the desert, thinking of every woman who had been made to feel fragile or foolish simply because someone wanted what she had. And in that moment, I knew with complete certainty that I was no longer afraid of anyone trying to rewrite my story, because I had taken control of it in a way Evan never foresaw, in a way that honored both my strength and the memory of the man who believed in me long before I believed in myself. Later that night, as I sat at my small kitchen table reviewing the schedule for the upcoming workshop, I felt a quiet gratitude for the strange and painful path that had led me here, because without it, I might never have discovered what I was capable of or how fiercely I could protect what mattered. And even though the past months had carved deep lines of exhaustion across my days, they had also carved resilience, the kind that stays, the kind that shapes a new life, rather than merely surviving an old one. When I finally turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I lingered for a moment in the doorway, listening to the stillness of the condo, feeling its safety in a way I never fully had before. And I thought of every woman who would hear my story and find a piece of herself in it, every woman who had been dismissed or manipulated or made to feel small inside her own home. And I hoped that by stepping into my strength, I could help them step into theirs. As I lay down beneath the soft hum of the ceiling fan, the last thought that passed through my mind was a simple one. A truth I had earned the hard way, that justice does not always come as a loud confrontation or a perfect apology. Sometimes it arrives quietly through boundaries held firm and futures reclaimed, through choosing peace over chaos, through refusing to let someone else define your worth. And as sleep finally pulled me under, I carried that truth with me like a promise for the rest of my life. If you are here with me at this point of the story, if you have followed every quiet rise and painful unraveling and final moment of peace, then comment justice, to stand with every woman who has ever been underestimated or controlled or treated as less than she was, because your voice reminds them that they are not alone.